My name is Audrey, 33 years old, and I am currently staring at my own mother as she commits federal perjury on the witness stand. She has not worked a single day since graduating college. My mother. Brenda sobbed into the microphone. She dabbed at her completely dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. My daughter is a parasite, Your Honor. She hacked into my late husband's trust fund and stole $4 million from her own family. The heavy oak walls of the federal courthouse echoed with her theatrical gasp. Behind me in the gallery, my older brother Jason let out a loud practiced sigh, shaking his head as if the weight of my supposed betrayal was too much for him to bear. He wore a custom-tailored Italian suit bought with money he had already siphoned from my father's commercial real estate business. Jason leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands, playing the role of the devastated son perfectly. Judge Mitchell peered over his reading glasses, his expression stern and completely unreadable. He looked down at me sitting quietly at the defendant table. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I simply folded my hands over my yellow legal pad and waited. Before I tell you exactly what was inside the thick sealed envelope my lawyer was about to hand, the judge let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch a toxic family member dig their own grave with their lies. You will want to stick around to find out how my mother had no idea she was actually walking straight into a trap I had set months ago. Your Honor. Brenda continued, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. Thomas worked his entire life to build his supply company. He wanted that money to secure our future, to protect his legacy, and Audrey just wiped it out. She transferred $4 million into a hidden offshore account, and she refuses to say where it is. She needs to be in jail. Judge Mitchell sighed and shifted his heavy gaze to my attorney. Mr. Cohen sat beside me, utterly relaxed. He did not object to Brenda's wild accusations. He did not interrupt her performance. He simply let her talk, allowing every single lie to be recorded forever by the court stenographer. Does the defense have anything to say about these severe allegations? Judge Mitchell asked, his voice booming through the quiet room. Ms. Audrey is facing a criminal referral if these claims hold any merit whatsoever. Mr. Cohen stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He picked up a thick manila envelope from our table. It was sealed with a heavy red wax stamp, marking it as a classified federal document. We do, Your Honor, Mr. Cohen said calmly. We have a single document that will clarify the exact location of the $4 million, as well as my client's current employment status, which the plaintiff seems to be so terribly confused about. Brenda let out a sharp, mocking laugh from the witness stand. Employment status, she sneered loudly. She sits in her apartment all day staring at a computer screen. She is a thief. Mr. Cohen ignored her completely. He stepped out from behind the heavy wooden table and handed the sealed envelope to the bailiff. The bailiff carried it up to the high bench. I watched my mother's face closely. For a split second her mask slipped. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed her eyes. She glanced back at Jason, who suddenly looked less smug and more annoyed. They had expected me to beg, to cry, to try and explain myself. They had brought me to court to publicly humiliate me and legally strip me of my rights, banking on the fact that I would be too intimidated by the legal system to fight back. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea that my silence over the last 3 months was not surrender, but an active, highly calculated investigation. Judge Mitchell took the envelope. He inspected the red seal, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. He broke the wax seal and pulled out the thick stack of papers inside. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the rustle of the pages turning. As his eyes scanned the first page, his posture completely changed. The annoyance of dealing with a petty family dispute vanished, replaced by a sharp, intense focus. He looked up from the document, staring directly at my mother, and then his gaze shifted to my brother in the gallery. The air in the room grew instantly cold. My mother shifted uncomfortably on the wooden bench, her fake tears completely forgotten. She swallowed hard, realizing that whatever was in that envelope had just shifted the power dynamic in the room entirely. I kept my eyes locked on her, offering a small, icy smile. The game was finally over, but to understand how we got to this exact moment in the courtroom, I have to take you back 3 months ago, to the day my father was buried when the first knife was planted in my back. 3 months ago, the scent of expensive lilies and stale gin hung heavily in the air at the Oak Ridge Country Club. We were supposed to be mourning the sudden passing of my father Thomas. Instead, the reception felt more like a networking event for the local elite. I stood near the back of the banquet hall by the silver catering chafing dishes, holding a lukewarm cup of black coffee. I watched my mother Brenda work the room. She wore a tailored black designer dress and a wide-brimmed hat, accepting condolences, while simultaneously ensuring the country club manager kept the premium champagne flowing. Across the room, my older brother Jason was holding court with a group of my father's business associates. He was laughing loudly, a glass of scotch in his hand, already acting like the newly crowned king of the local real estate market. There was no grief in his eyes. There was only greed. I kept my distance, preferring to observe. My father and I had a complicated relationship on the surface, mostly to protect my actual career, but we understood each other perfectly. He knew I was not the unemployed disappointment my mother painted me out to be. He knew exactly what I did for the federal government. My quiet observation was interrupted when Jason suddenly broke away from his group. He marched straight toward me, his face flushed from the alcohol. Brenda noticed his movement and immediately excused herself from the mayor's wife, rushing over to flank Jason. They cornered me between a towering ice sculpture and the dessert table. The catering staff quickly scattered, sensing the hostility radiating from my family. Jason did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. Without a word of warning, he aggressively shoved a folded piece of paper directly into my chest. I stumbled back slightly, my coffee sloshing over the rim of the cup and burning my fingers, but I caught the paper before it hit the floor. "Read it and weep." "Little sister," Jason sneered. His breath reeked of expensive liquor and cheap cigars. Dad finally wised up before he flatlined. He left the entire commercial real estate empire to me, the man of the house, like it should be. I carefully unfolded the paper. It was a single sheet of lined notebook paper torn hastily from a spiral binder. The ink was bright blue ballpoint. I stared at the handwriting. As a forensic accountant, my entire career revolves around analyzing documents, verifying signatures, and spotting financial fraud. The document in my hands was the most pathetic excuse for a legal will I had ever seen in my life. The handwriting was a blocky, forced print, nothing like my father's sweeping cursive. The date at the top was written as 2 days prior to his death, a time when my father was fully sedated and intubated in the intensive care unit, physically incapable of holding a pen. There were no witness signatures. There was no notary stamp. It was a blatant, sloppy forgery. "You get nothing, Audrey," my mother hissed, stepping closer, so her face was only inches from mine. Her voice was a venomous whisper, ensuring the wealthy guests across the room could not hear her. "Your father realized you are a lost cause. You are 33 years old and you have absolutely nothing to show for your life. No husband, no career. You just sit in your apartment all day. Jason is the only one capable of running the company." I looked up from the forged document and met my mother's cold gaze. I could have called them out right then and there. I could have pointed out the fraudulent date and the laughable signature. But in my line of work, you never interrupt a criminal when they are handing you physical evidence of their crime. "Is this the only copy?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. Jason snatched the paper back from my hands, folding it roughly and shoving it into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. "It is the only copy that matters," he spat. "The company lawyer is already processing it. You are out, Audrey. Dad's trust fund, the business, the properties. It all belongs to me now." I nodded slowly, taking a napkin from the catering table to wipe the spilled coffee from my hands. I did not argue. I did not scream. I just looked at the two of them, cataloging their arrogance. "Congratulations, Jason," I said softly. "I hope you know exactly what you are inheriting." My lack of a dramatic reaction clearly disappointed them. They wanted a fight. They wanted a scene. Instead, I simply turned my back on them and walked straight toward the exit. I did not even make it to the heavy glass doors. My mother's voice rang out across the banquet hall, sharp and calculated to cut through the low hum of polite conversation. "Audrey, stop right there." The sudden volume shift caused dozens of heads to turn. Aunts, uncles, and my father's business partners fell completely silent, their eyes darting between me and Brenda. She marched toward me, no longer bothering to keep her voice down. Jason trailed right behind her, a smug smile playing on his lips. I stopped and turned around, letting my arms hang loosely at my sides. "You are not leaving until you give me the keys," Brenda demanded, thrusting her manicured hand out. "I want the house keys, the alarm fob, and the garage remote. Right now." A low murmur rippled through the nearby tables. My aunt clutched her pearl necklace, whispering something to her husband. I looked at my mother's outstretched hand. The childhood home she was referring to was a sprawling 5-bedroom estate in the affluent suburbs, a property my father had promised would remain in the family for generations. "Why do you need my keys?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, feeding her the line she so desperately wanted to answer. Brenda let out a dramatic, sorrowful sigh, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Because we have to sell the house, Audrey. We have no choice. Your father left us with a mountain of responsibilities, and we simply cannot afford to drain the estate to pay off your massive credit card debts anymore. It is time for you to face the consequences of your reckless spending. You are 33 years old and bankrupting this family." Gasps echoed from the extended family. Whispers of disapproval floated through the air. Poor Brenda dealing with a dead husband and a deadbeat daughter. I could practically read their minds. Jason stood there looking at the floor in mock sorrow, playing the responsible older brother burdened by his sister's financial ruin. It was a brilliant theatrical performance. They were establishing the narrative right there at the funeral reception, painting me as a financial liability, so no one would question why I was suddenly cut out of the family wealth. What Brenda did not know, and what Jason was desperately trying to hide from her, was the actual reality of that 5-bedroom estate. I did not have a single dollar of credit card debt. I paid my balances in full every month with my 6-figure salary from the Internal Revenue Service. But Jason, the golden boy, had a crippling underground gambling addiction. 2 years ago, he had secretly convinced our ailing father to leverage the childhood home as collateral for a massive commercial loan. Jason immediately siphoned those funds to pay off his bookies. Because Jason had not made a single payment on that loan in over 8 months, the bank had already initiated foreclosure proceedings. I knew this because I had pulled the public financial records the moment my father entered hospice care. The bank was planning to serve the eviction notice by the end of the week. Brenda believed she was kicking me out to sell the house and keep the profits. She had absolutely no idea the property already belonged to the bank. I looked at Jason. He met my gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly, challenging me to argue. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. I reached into my black leather purse and pulled out my heavy keyring. The metal clinked loudly in the quiet room. I slowly detached the brass house key, the plastic alarm fob, and the bulky garage remote. I placed them deliberately into my mother's waiting palm. Her fingers closed around them like a vulture securing its prey. "I hope the sale of the house brings you exactly what you deserve, Mother," I said clearly, ensuring the silent crowd heard every word. "And, Jason," I added, turning my eyes to my brother, "good luck managing the property transfer. I hear bank audits can be quite stressful." Jason's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny muscle twitching in his jaw. Brenda simply scoffed, dropping the keys into her designer clutch without a second thought. "Get your belongings out of the guest room by tomorrow morning," she ordered dismissively. "We are changing the alarm codes tonight." I nodded once, turned on my heel, and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the country club. The cool evening air hit my face, bringing instant relief. They thought they had left me homeless and penniless. They thought they had won. As I walked to my car, I pulled out my phone. The real financial game was about to begin tomorrow morning. The next morning, the sky over the city was a bruised purple as I pulled my sedan into the parking lot of the elite downtown branch of our family bank. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors unlocked. I walked straight to the premier client desk, completely bypassing the standard teller lines. For over 30 years, my father had kept the company's operating accounts here alongside our individual personal accounts. The bank staff usually tripped over themselves to serve anyone from our family. Today, however, the atmosphere was entirely different. I approached the desk of a junior branch manager named Gregory. I had known Gregory for 5 years. Usually he would leap out of his leather chair to offer me sparkling water and a warm smile. This time he remained seated. He adjusted his tie nervously, his eyes darting toward the glass walls of his office before looking back at me. His posture was rigid, and his usual welcoming demeanor had been replaced by a thin, condescending smirk. "Good morning, Gregory," I said, evenly sliding my platinum debit card and driver's license across the polished mahogany desk. "I need to make a cash withdrawal from my personal checking account, and I need to request a certified cashier's check for the remaining balance of my savings." Gregory did not reach for my cards. He steepled his fingers together, leaning back in his chair with an air of unearned authority. "I am afraid I cannot process any transactions for you today, Audrey," he said, dropping the polite courtesy titles he usually used. "Or tomorrow, for that matter." I kept my expression blank, calculating my mother's exact moves. "And why is that, Gregory? Is there a technical malfunction?" Gregory let out a short, patronizing sigh. "There is no technical issue. Your accounts have been frozen, all of them. Checking savings and the small investment portfolio you hold with us. We received an emergency court injunction first thing this morning filed by your mother's legal team. She has officially designated you as a severe flight risk due to the ongoing investigation into the missing trust funds." I stared at him. The sheer audacity of Brenda's legal maneuver was impressive in a highly illegal, desperate sort of way. An emergency court injunction requires substantial proof of a crime. She had convinced a sleepy off-hours duty judge to sign a temporary freeze based entirely on her fabricated story of me hacking the family trust. She had spent the entire night on the phone weaponizing her country club tears to push the paperwork through. Gregory leaned forward, his smirk widening. "Your mother called the branch president personally at 6 in the morning to warn us. She said you might try to drain your accounts and flee the state. We are strictly prohibited from dispensing a single dime to you until the formal hearing. I must say, Audrey, the bank is highly disappointed. Your father was a great man. To steal from his legacy is quite shocking." Before I could inform Gregory that he was dangerously close to a defamation lawsuit, a loud, familiar laugh echoed through the quiet bank lobby. Jason strolled into Gregory's office without knocking. He was wearing his expensive golf attire, looking entirely too cheerful for a man who had just buried his father the day before. He held a thick stack of bank documents in one hand and a sleek leather wallet in the other. He had clearly just finished meeting with the commercial lending department, likely trying to secure more funds using the forged will. "Having a little cash flow problem," little sister Jason mocked, standing right behind my chair. "I heard the tragic news. Frozen out. Penniless. It is really a shame what happens when you cross the people who put a roof over your head." "Good morning, Jason," Gregory chimed in eagerly. "Everything is handled on this end. The freeze is absolute." Jason ignored Gregory, keeping his predatory gaze fixed on me. "You should have just stayed quiet at the funeral, Audrey. You should have just accepted your place. Now look at you. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee. You are completely locked out of the real world." He opened his wallet, dramatically pulling out a crisp new $100 bill. He flicked his wrist, tossing the bill so it fluttered down and landed right on top of my driver's license on the desk. "Take it," Jason sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Buy yourself a cheap bus ticket out of town. Go start over somewhere else because you are officially finished here. Do not ever show your face at the company or the house again." I looked at the $100 bill resting on the mahogany desk. I did not reach for it. I did not raise my voice or show any sign of the panic they were so desperately waiting to see. I simply picked up my debit card and my ID, leaving his money untouched. "Keep it, Jason," I said quietly, standing up and pushing my chair in. "You are going to need every single dollar for your commissary account." Jason frowned, clearly confused by the prison reference, but I did not stay to explain. I turned and walked out of the office, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor of the lobby. The heavy glass doors of the bank slid shut behind me, cutting off the quiet lobby and replacing it with the roar of traffic. Jason was likely standing at the window, imagining me breaking down in tears. I walked steadily to my unremarkable gray sedan, unlocked the heavy door, and slid into the driver's seat. I locked the doors immediately after. Only then did I let out a long, slow, controlled exhale. I opened the glove compartment and bypassed my standard smartphone. Instead, I pulled out a thick encrypted burner phone. It was an agency-issued device, untraceable and secured with military-grade encryption. I powered it on, punched in a 12-digit passcode, and waited for the network to connect. I dialed a number that was not saved in the contacts. It rang exactly twice before a gruff voice answered. "Go ahead," the voice said. It was Special Agent Reynolds, my direct supervisor at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. "It is Audrey," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "The bait has been taken. The targets have officially executed the emergency freeze on my civilian financial accounts as of this morning. They are using the fabricated story of the hacked trust fund as their probable cause." Reynolds let out a low whistle over the line. "So they actually went through with it, swearing out a false injunction on federal assets. They are incredibly arrogant or incredibly stupid, possibly both. Have they attempted to move any of the commercial real estate funds yet?" "Jason was meeting with the commercial lending department just now," I replied, watching a delivery truck rumble past my windshield. "He is holding the forged will. He believes he has full legal authority to liquidate the properties. I need you to initiate immediate round-the-clock surveillance on his offshore routing numbers, specifically the Cayman Islands Limited Liability Company he set up last year. I want every single digital footprint tracked the moment a wire transfer is initiated." "Consider it done," Reynolds said. "The cyber team is already monitoring the primary nodes. You know, Audrey, your father was incredibly brave for bringing this to us when he realized what his own wife and son were doing. He wanted to protect his life's work." "I know," I said, my chest tightening just a fraction at the mention of my father. Thomas had discovered the embezzlement 6 months before his death. Instead of confronting Jason and Brenda, which would have allowed them to hide the money, he came to me. He asked his daughter, the federal investigator, to help him take down his own family. We legally transferred the $4 million trust fund into a federally protected Sting account. The money they were accusing me of stealing was currently sitting in a vault, monitored by the United States government. "Stay frosty," Audrey Reynolds warned. "They think you are a helpless, unemployed victim. They have cut off your apparent cash supply to make you desperate. Do not break cover until they commit the wire fraud." "I am not desperate at all," I said coldly. "I am exactly where I need to be." I ended the call and tossed the burner phone back into the glove compartment. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My mother and brother thought they were playing chess against a naive, jobless 33-year-old woman who relied on family handouts. They thought the bank freeze was a checkmate. They had no idea they had just walked onto a board controlled entirely by a federal agency, and I was holding all the winning pieces. But a federal financial investigation takes time, and paper trails can sometimes be obscured if the criminal has a smart enough broker. Jason was reckless, but he was using a highly intelligent shield to conduct his real estate transactions. He was using his wife. I started the engine of my car. Jason's wife, Keisha, was a brilliant self-made 34-year-old Black African-American woman who had built her own highly successful luxury real estate brokerage from the ground up. Keisha was a force of nature, fiercely independent, and incredibly protective of her professional reputation. She had always kept her distance from Brenda's toxic country club behavior. I knew Keisha was not involved in the embezzlement. Jason was simply using her brokerage and her real estate license as a legitimate front to liquidate my father's properties and wash the money clean. It was time to pay my sister-in-law a visit. It was time to show her the absolute truth before Jason dragged her down with him. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the bank parking lot, heading straight for the upscale downtown district where Keisha ran her empire. The upscale downtown district was a stark contrast to the quiet suburbs. Towering glass buildings reflected the late morning sun, and at the heart of it all was Vanguard luxury real estate. Keisha had built this brokerage from the ground up. At 34 years old, my sister-in-law was a powerhouse. As a brilliant black African-American woman in a fiercely competitive male-dominated market, Keisha clawed her way to the top through relentless work and an ironclad reputation. She did not tolerate fools, and she certainly did not tolerate sloppy business, which is exactly why Jason was currently driving her insane. I parked down the block and walked toward the sleek floor-to-ceiling windows of Vanguard. From the sidewalk I could see straight into Keisha's private corner office. The tension inside was palpable even from 50 feet away. Keisha sat behind her massive glass desk dressed impeccably in a sharp emerald green suit. She was rubbing her temples looking utterly exhausted. Jason was pacing back and forth in front of her desk, waving a sheaf of papers wildly in the air. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped into the pristine lobby, keeping my distance near a massive marble pillar so I could observe them through the glass walls. I could not hear every word being spoken inside, but I knew Jason's body language well enough to read the chaotic situation perfectly. Jason slammed the papers down on Keisha's desk. They were the property deeds to 3 of my father's most valuable commercial warehouses. Keisha picked them up slowly, her expression tightening. I watched her shake her head clearly, arguing against whatever reckless plan Jason was proposing. She pointed to her computer screen, likely pulling up the current market valuations. Those warehouses were prime real estate. They needed time, proper staging, and a calculated bidding war to secure their true worth. Jason shook his head aggressively, rejecting her professional advice outright. He leaned over the polished glass desk, aggressively invading her personal space. He demanded an absolute fire sale. He wanted those properties listed immediately and liquidated within the week regardless of the massive financial loss. Keisha stood up, her posture rigid. She crossed her arms, refusing to be intimidated by his erratic behavior. She was a professional broker who handled multi-million-dollar deals daily. She was not going to let her husband ruin her flawless track record with a desperate, poorly executed liquidation. I watched her point a manicured finger at the paperwork, asking him a direct question that made Jason flinch. He quickly pulled another document from his jacket pocket and shoved it toward her. It was a routing slip. Even from the lobby, I recognized the distinct blue formatting of an international wire transfer request. Jason was not just demanding a fast sale. He was giving her highly irregular instructions on where to send the millions of dollars once the properties closed. Keisha examined the slip, her brow furrowing in deep suspicion. She tapped the paper, demanding an explanation. Jason threw his hands up in exasperation, his face turning red. I knew exactly what was written on that slip. It was the routing information for Apex Holdings Group, a bizarre limited liability company registered in the Cayman Islands. It was the exact shell company my federal team was currently monitoring. Jason paced the length of the office again, arguing aggressively. I could see him using his typical manipulation tactics, puffing out his chest, and acting entirely offended that she would question him. He likely told her that he was the new head of the family, that the properties were his inheritance, and that she just needed to do her job and process the paperwork. He wanted the cash untraceable, and he needed her real estate license to legitimize the massive transfer of wealth. Keisha threw the wire transfer slip back onto the desk, flatly refusing. She shook her head firmly, sitting back down and turning her attention to her computer. She was not going to risk her brokerage license or face a federal audit over an international wire transfer she could not verify. Jason slammed his fist on the glass desk, shouting something that made Keisha's assistant jump in her seat. Keisha did not even flinch. She simply pointed toward the door. Furious that his bullying failed, Jason snatched the routing slip off the desk. He stormed out of her office, his face flushed with anger. He shoved past the assistant and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the suite, completely oblivious to me standing behind the marble pillar in the lobby. I waited until Jason exited the building entirely. Then I adjusted my bag on my shoulder and walked directly toward Keisha's office. It was time to give her the final missing piece of the dangerous puzzle. I stepped out from behind the cool marble pillar and walked purposefully toward the receptionist's desk. The young assistant was still visibly rattled from Jason's explosive exit, frantically organizing scattered papers. She looked up, her eyes widening as she recognized me. She reached for the intercom button, likely to warn her boss that another member of my chaotic family had breached the perimeter. "Do not bother," I told the assistant, keeping my voice gentle but authoritative. "I will only be a minute." Before she could protest, I walked past her desk and pushed open the heavy glass door to the corner office. The room smelled of expensive espresso and leather. Keisha was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring down at the busy city streets below. At the sound of the door closing, she whipped around. Her expression instantly hardened. Keisha was a woman who commanded respect, and right now her patience was entirely depleted. She let out a sharp, exhausted sigh and marched back to her massive mahogany desk, planting both hands flat on the polished surface. "Audrey, I am going to stop you right there," Keisha said, her voice sharp and uncompromising. "I just spent the last 20 minutes dealing with your brother throwing a spectacular temper tantrum in my office. I already know about the court injunction. I know Brenda froze your bank accounts this morning. If you are here to drag me into whatever toxic inheritance war you and Jason are waging, or if you are here to ask me for a personal loan because you cannot pay your rent, the answer is absolutely not." She glared at me, fully expecting me to burst into tears or start screaming about how unfair my mother was being. That was the dynamic my family had established for me. The weak, unemployed victim who constantly needed rescuing. I did not react to her harsh tone. I completely understood it. From her perspective, she was married into a family of lunatics, and I was just another liability. I walked slowly across the plush carpet until I was standing directly across from her at the mahogany desk. I did not sit down. "I am not here for a loan, Keisha," I said quietly. "And I am certainly not here to drag you into a family fight. I am here to pull you out of a federal indictment." Keisha blinked, her defensive posture faltering for a fraction of a second. She frowned, clearly confused by my calm demeanor and the sudden mention of federal charges. "Excuse me?" she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" I unzipped my black leather tote bag. I reached inside and pulled out a standard unmarked manila folder. I placed it gently on the center of her pristine desk. The folder contained exactly 3 pages of a heavily redacted financial audit report pulled directly from the Internal Revenue Service database earlier that morning. Most of the sensitive government codes and tracking numbers were blacked out with a thick marker, but the core information, the routing numbers, the corporate registry data, and the dates of incorporation were left perfectly visible. I looked Keisha dead in the eyes. "I know Jason just demanded that you execute a fire sale on my father's commercial warehouses. I also know he handed you a wire transfer slip routing the profits to a company called Apex Holdings Group in the Cayman Islands." Keisha's breath hitched slightly. Her professional mask slipped, revealing genuine shock. "How could you possibly know about the Cayman routing slip?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He literally just handed that to me 10 minutes ago. No one else has seen it." I ignored her question and pointed a finger at the manila folder resting between us. "Open the file, Keisha. Look at the corporate registry data for Apex Holdings Group. Look at the names listed on the offshore incorporation documents." Keisha stared at the folder as if it were a live explosive. She hesitated, her sharp instincts battling with her natural suspicion of me. Finally, she reached out and flipped the folder open. Her eyes darted across the redacted pages, scanning the highlighted sections I had specifically prepared for her. Jason is not just stealing my inheritance, I said, my voice steady and cold. He is using your brokerage to launder the money. And worse, he is setting you up for the fall. Check the primary stakeholder name on that LLC, Keisha. I did not wait for her to read the name aloud. I did not wait for her to ask me another question. I did not want to give her the opportunity to argue or rationalize her husband's behavior. The evidence in front of her was absolute and undeniable. I simply turned around, pushed open the heavy glass door, and walked out of the office, leaving her standing alone in the suffocating silence of the truth. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind me, leaving Keisha completely alone in her corner office. For a long moment she did not move. She simply stared at the open manila folder resting on her mahogany desk. The ambient noise of the busy city streets outside her window seemed to fade into a dull hum. Slowly her eyes dropped back to the highlighted section of the corporate registry data I had left behind. She read the primary stakeholder name listed on the Cayman Islands Limited Liability Company documents. It was not Jason. It was not my father. The name printed in stark black ink was Keisha Vanguard. A cold chill radiated through her chest. She reached out with trembling fingers and traced the letters of her own name. Jason was not just hiding money in a secret account. He had explicitly named her as the sole owner and primary beneficiary of an offshore shell company. The weight of the implication crashed into her all at once. If this document was real, Jason was legally framing her for international wire fraud. Keisha was not a woman who panicked blindly. She was a top-tier professional whose entire career relied on legal integrity, meticulous documentation, and absolute control. She immediately marched over to her office door and locked it. She closed the vertical blinds, shutting out the view of her bustling sales floor. She needed absolute privacy. She needed to tear this information apart and verify every single detail herself. She sat back down at her desk and rapidly typed her password into her computer. She bypassed her standard property management systems and logged directly into a secure premium forensic real estate database she used for high-level commercial background checks. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she entered the registration number for Apex Holdings Group. The search engine spun for a few agonizing seconds before populating a dense wall of digital records. Keisha bypassed the summary page and drilled straight down into the original articles of incorporation filed 2 years ago. She downloaded the scanned PDF of the founding charter, her heart pounding furiously against her ribs. She scrolled to the final page of the document. There, at the bottom of the signature line, was her own handwriting. It was a near-perfect replica of her signature, but Keisha spent hours every week signing multi-million-dollar contracts. She knew the exact pressure and slant of her own penmanship. The signature on the screen was slightly stiff. It lacked her usual fluid motion. It was a digital trace, likely lifted directly from their joint tax returns or mortgage documents that Jason had access to at home. The betrayal was so profound it made her physically nauseous. She forced herself to keep digging. She pulled up the historical transaction logs associated with the shell company. Her eyes widened in horror as she read the ledgers. Over the past 24 months, millions of dollars had flowed into this offshore account. The deposits were all labeled as consulting fees, property management retainers, and asset liquidation bonuses. Every single dollar originated from Thomas's commercial real estate company. Then she found the final, most devastating piece of evidence. She checked the broker authorization number attached to the real estate liquidation requests tied to the offshore account. It was her own state-issued commercial broker identification number. Jason had weaponized her hard-earned credentials. He had been using her pristine professional reputation and her real estate license as a bulletproof shield for his massive embezzlement scheme. He knew that any standard financial audit would look at the paperwork and assume Keisha Vanguard, a highly successful and wealthy broker, was simply managing international investments for her husband's family business. If the federal government ever caught wind of the missing money, the entire paper trail led straight to her desk. Jason would play the victim, claiming he trusted his expert wife to handle the complex financial structuring. She would go to federal prison and he would walk away completely clean with the stolen millions. Keisha leaned back in her leather chair, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The man she had married, the man she slept next to every night, had spent the last 2 years methodically building a legal trapdoor under her life. He was entirely willing to sacrifice her freedom to cover his own gambling debts and greed. The sadness and shock evaporated, replaced instantly by a blinding white-hot rage. Keisha picked up the wire transfer slip Jason had demanded she process just 20 minutes earlier. She slowly tore it into tiny pieces, letting the confetti fall into her metal wastebasket. Jason had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had underestimated her intelligence, and he had underestimated her wrath. Keisha did not wait until the end of the workday. She grabbed her designer trench coat, walked straight past her stunned assistant without a single word of explanation, and took the private elevator down to the parking garage. The drive back to the luxury penthouse she shared with Jason was usually a 20-minute commute. Today, fueled by pure adrenaline and cold fury, she made it in 12. When she unlocked the massive oak double doors of their residence, the sheer audacity of Jason's relaxed demeanor nearly sent her over the edge. He was sitting on the custom Italian leather sofa, pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon, watching a golf tournament on the massive flat-screen television. He looked completely unbothered, fully convinced that Keisha would eventually process his fraudulent paperwork just to keep the peace. Keisha marched into the living room and threw her heavy leather tote bag onto the glass coffee table with a loud crash. Jason jumped, spilling amber liquid onto his wrist. "Have you completely lost your mind, Keisha?" Jason snapped, grabbing a silk napkin to wipe his hand. "What is wrong with you?" Keisha did not yell. Her voice dropped into a terrifyingly calm register. "Apex Holdings Group," she stated plainly, watching his eyes widen in unfiltered panic. "Do not try to lie to me, Jason. I just pulled the corporate registry documents from the international database. You forged my signature to create a shell company in the Cayman Islands, and you have been using my state-issued commercial broker identification number to funnel millions of dollars out of your father's business." Jason recovered his composure almost instantly. It was a terrifying testament to his sociopathic nature. He set his glass down and let out a loud, condescending laugh. "Keisha, you are being completely hysterical right now. You signed those incorporation papers 6 months ago when we updated our tax strategy. You probably just forgot because you are always so stressed out with your little housing market projects. It is a standard asset protection trust. You simply do not understand high-level corporate finance." "I do not understand finance," she repeated, her tone dripping with venom. "I built a multi-million-dollar brokerage from the ground up while you blew your allowance on sports bets. You committed federal wire fraud and identity theft, Jason. You framed me to take the fall for your embezzlement." Before Jason could formulate another lie, the sound of heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed from the hallway. Brenda strolled into the living room carrying a shopping bag from an exclusive boutique. She had evidently let herself in with her spare key. "What on earth is all this screaming about?" Brenda demanded, looking Keisha up and down with polite distaste. "I could hear you shouting from the elevator lobby. It is entirely unseemly. Your son just forged my signature on an international shell company to launder stolen money," Keisha fired back, refusing to back down. Brenda did not even flinch. She did not look shocked or appalled. Instead, she walked over to Jason, resting a protective hand on his shoulder. She looked at Keisha with a cold, condescending smile. "Keisha, darling, you are overreacting as usual," Brenda said, her voice laced with sickly sweet venom. "Jason is the head of his father's company now. He is simply restructuring family assets. You should be thanking him for including your name on the accounts. We welcomed you into this family with open arms despite your background." Keisha froze. "Excuse me," she said quietly. Brenda waved a dismissive hand. "Let us be brutally honest, Keisha. You have a nice little business selling houses, but you did not come from our world. Jason elevated your social status the minute he put a ring on your finger. We gave you access to the country club, to our wealthy network of friends, to a life you never could have achieved on your own. It is extremely ungrateful of you to bite the hand that feeds you just because you do not comprehend how generational wealth is managed. The racism and classism in Brenda's tone were razor-sharp and unmistakable. She was reducing Keisha, a self-made brilliant black woman, to nothing more than a charity case who should blindly accept her husband's criminal behavior as the price of admission into their wealthy white suburban circle. Jason stood there smirking behind his mother, clearly enjoying Keisha's stunned silence. Keisha looked back and forth between them. She saw the absolute delusion in Brenda's eyes and the cowardly arrogance in Jason's posture. They truly believed their last name and their zip code protected them from the laws of the real world. Keisha realized in that exact moment there was no reasoning with these people. They were a sinking ship, actively trying to chain her to the anchor. She took a deep breath, smoothing the front of her emerald green suit, her mind rapidly shifting from a betrayed wife to a tactical adversary. "Are you threatening me, Brenda?" Keisha asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. Brenda smiled, adjusting the strap of her exclusive boutique shopping bag. "I am simply explaining the reality of your situation, darling. You rely heavily on the wealthy network of this family to sell your little luxury houses. The people at the country club listen to me. They respect my family name. If you refuse to process Jason's property transfers today, I will personally make sure your career is over. I will make one phone call to the club president. I will tell everyone in our social circle that Vanguard Luxury Real Estate is actively under federal investigation for mishandling family assets. I will ruin your professional reputation overnight. You will be back to renting cheap apartments on the east side of the city before the end of the month." Jason smirked, swirling the expensive bourbon in his crystal glass. "Come on, Keisha. Just do the paperwork. It is really not that hard. Stop trying to play the righteous moral compass and just be a supportive wife for once. We are talking about millions of dollars here. Your cut will be more than enough to keep your little business afloat." The sheer audacity of their synchronized threat hung heavily in the luxurious living room. Keisha looked at her husband, the man she had loved, supported, and built a life with, and saw nothing but a greedy, hollow shell of a human being. She looked at her mother-in-law, a woman dripping in unearned wealth and casual racism, completely comfortable destroying another woman's entire life just to protect her own lavish comfort. In that crystal-clear moment, Audrey's words echoed loudly in Keisha's mind. "He is setting you up for the fall." Audrey had not come to the brokerage looking for a handout or a shoulder to cry on. Audrey had come to deliver a highly calculated warning. Keisha realized with terrifying clarity that Audrey was absolutely right. Every single word Audrey had spoken earlier that day was the unvarnished truth. The family was not just dysfunctional. They were an organized, toxic criminal syndicate. They were actively trying to frame Keisha for federal wire fraud while simultaneously demanding her gratitude and absolute obedience. Keisha did not break down. She did not raise her voice to match theirs. She simply walked over to the glass coffee table, picked up her heavy leather tote bag, and turned back to face her abusers. "Let me explain the actual reality of your situation," Keisha said, her tone reaching absolute zero. "I built my brokerage with my own two hands. My license, my ethics, and my reputation are pristine. You, on the other hand, have committed federal forgery. You have initiated illegal offshore wire transfers. You are attempting to liquidate commercial assets that do not legally belong to you. And right now, you are actively attempting to extort a licensed state broker." Brenda scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "Oh, please, stop with the dramatic legal vocabulary. Nobody is going to listen to you over us." Keisha ignored her completely and focused her burning gaze entirely on Jason. "This penthouse is in my name, Jason. I bought it before we were married. The mortgage is paid exclusively from my personal account. You have exactly 2 minutes to put that glass down, pack whatever fits into a single suitcase, and get out of my home. Jason laughed, a nervous, jagged sound that betrayed his sudden panic. You cannot kick me out of my own apartment, Keisha. You are acting crazy. I am your husband. You are a criminal liability, Keisha corrected sharply, stepping closer to him. And if you and your mother are not out of my sight in exactly 120 seconds, I am calling the police. I will hand them the forged offshore incorporation documents myself. I will tell them exactly what you did to your father's company. I will have you arrested for felony fraud right here in this living room. The smug smile finally slid completely off Jason's face. He looked into Keisha's eyes and realized she was not bluffing. The absolute terrifying certainty in her voice paralyzed him. Brenda's arrogant posture stiffened. She looked at her son, expecting him to assert his dominance and put his wife in her place, but Jason was already backing away toward the master bedroom. You are making a massive mistake, Keisha. Brenda hissed, her polite society facade completely shattering to reveal the monster beneath. You are going to regret this. We will destroy you. Get out of my house, Brenda, Keisha commanded, pointing a rigid finger toward the front door. Before I have the building security team drag you out into the lobby by your designer coat. Brenda opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer ferocity radiating from Keisha silenced her. Furious and deeply humiliated, Brenda turned on her heel and marched out of the penthouse, the heavy oak double doors slamming violently shut behind her. A moment later, Jason emerged from the bedroom clutching a hastily packed leather duffel bag. His face was pale and slick with sweat. He opened his mouth to try one last desperate manipulation tactic, but Keisha did not give him the chance. Leave your keys on the granite counter, she ordered. Jason swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly as he dropped his heavy set of keys onto the kitchen island. He walked out of the apartment without saying another word. As soon as the door clicked shut, Keisha threw the heavy deadbolt. She immediately engaged the electronic security system. She walked briskly down the long hallway and entered her private home office, slamming the heavy wooden doors shut and locking them securely from the inside. She was completely alone in the massive penthouse. Her marriage was effectively over. Her husband had tried to frame her for a massive federal crime to save his own skin. But Keisha did not shed a single tear. She walked over to her desk, booted up her secure desktop computer, and reached for her phone. She needed to speak to Audrey immediately. They had a war to win. Inside the manila folder I had left on her desk, I had tucked a small white business card containing only a 10-digit phone number. It was a secure line directly to my agency-issued burner phone. When the device vibrated on my passenger seat 30 minutes later, I already knew who was calling. I picked it up on the first ring. We need to meet Keisha, said her voice completely devoid of its usual polished warmth. It was sharp, clinical, and all business. Right now. I gave her the address of a subterranean parking garage beneath an abandoned commercial plaza on the edge of the city limits. It was a location frequently used by my federal team for secure informant drops. There were no active security cameras, and the concrete walls blocked all cellular tracking. I arrived first, backing my gray sedan into a dark corner spot, keeping the engine running and the headlights off. 15 minutes later, the sleek headlights of Keisha's black luxury vehicle swept across the concrete pillars. She pulled into the empty space directly across from me, killed the engine, and stepped out. She was still wearing her emerald green suit, but she had swapped her designer heels for sensible flat shoes. She carried a heavy canvas duffel bag over her shoulder. I stepped out of my car and met her halfway in the dimly lit corridor between our vehicles. The silence of the underground garage was heavy and absolute. For a long moment we just looked at each other. For years Brenda and Jason had actively worked to keep us alienated from one another. They had painted Keisha to me as a greedy social climber, and they had painted me to Keisha as a lazy, entitled failure. Standing there in the cold concrete shadows, the family illusions completely shattered. We were just two women who had been chronically underestimated and relentlessly manipulated by the exact same people. Keisha did not offer a polite greeting. She unzipped the canvas duffel bag and pulled out a sleek silver laptop. She practically shoved it into my hands. I found this hidden in the false bottom of Jason's golf club travel case. While I was waiting for him to pack his things, Keisha said, her eyes burning with an intense, calculated anger. He locked me out of the administrative privileges, but I know him. He uses the same terrible password variations for everything. I got in. It is his personal financial ledger. It contains every single illegal transaction he has made since your father first fell ill. I took the laptop, feeling the heavy weight of the evidence. This was the holy grail. My cyber team would crack the remaining encryption in less than an hour. But Keisha was not finished. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a small black flash drive. She held it up between her fingers so the dim overhead light caught the plastic casing. And this, she continued, is a complete download of every falsified wire transfer request he tried to process through my brokerage. It includes the time-stamped computer addresses proving he accessed the portal from his personal devices, not mine. I also included the security footage from my office lobby showing him physically handing me the fraudulent Cayman Islands routing slip today. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I would just act like a dutiful, terrified wife and take the fall. I took the flash drive and slipped it securely into my jacket pocket. "You understand what happens next, Keisha?" I asked quietly. "Once I hand this over to my team, there is no stopping the federal machine. Jason will go to prison, the family name will be publicly disgraced, and your divorce will be incredibly messy." Keisha let out a short, humorless laugh. "My divorce will be a surgical extraction, Audrey. I have already frozen his access to my personal accounts and kicked him out of the penthouse. Let the family name burn. I built my own legacy, and I am not letting your brother drag it into a federal courtroom. I want him absolutely destroyed." I nodded slowly, a profound sense of respect washing over me. In a family built entirely on lies and superficial appearances, Keisha was the only person who actually shared my father's ruthless commitment to the truth. We were no longer just sisters-in-law. We were a highly functioning lethal alliance. "Keep your distance from them for the next few days," I advised her, placing the silver laptop on the hood of my car. "Do not answer their calls. Let Jason panic. Let Brenda think she has won by cutting off my bank accounts. They are going to get sloppy, and I need them feeling incredibly confident for the next phase of the operation." "What exactly is the next phase?" Keisha asked, crossing her arms over her chest. I looked at her, allowing a thin, cold smile to touch my lips. "Brenda just invited me to her annual Thanksgiving dinner. She told me she wants to make peace, but she invited the corporate board members and the corrupt family lawyer. She is setting a trap to legally strip me of my remaining rights." Keisha raised an eyebrow. "And you are going to walk right into it." "I am going to bring the main course," I replied quietly. Keisha held my gaze for a second longer, a mutual understanding passing between us. She nodded once, turned around, and walked back to her luxury vehicle. She drove out of the underground garage, leaving me alone in the dark. I looked down at the silver laptop resting on my hood. Jason had handed me the murder weapon, and Brenda had just invited me to the execution. All I had to do now was show up. Thursday afternoon arrived with a chill. It was Thanksgiving Day, 4 days after the emergency bank freeze. My burner phone buzzed earlier that morning, with a pleasant text from my mother. Brenda claimed the holiday season made her reflect on family, and she wanted me to come to the estate for dinner to put our differences aside. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, but I replied with a polite confirmation. I knew exactly what she was planning. Before leaving my apartment, I met with Agent Reynolds in an unmarked van parked 3 blocks down the street. He taped a micro-transmitter to my collarbone, securing the microphone beneath a high-necked burgundy sweater. The audio feed connected directly to the federal recording server at the field office. Every word spoken in that house would be permanently logged as federal evidence. I was not just going to a holiday dinner. I was walking into an active criminal sting operation. I pulled my sedan into the driveway of my childhood home. The massive brick colonial estate was brightly lit, looking perfect. Jason's sports car was parked near the front doors, flanked by 3 black luxury sedans I did not recognize. Clearly, this was not an intimate family gathering. I parked near the street. I walked up the stone steps and rang the doorbell, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my heart rate. Brenda opened the heavy oak door almost immediately. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere dress and a string of heavy pearls. She offered a stiff, incredibly fake smile, her eyes remaining cold and calculating as she ushered me inside. The foyer smelled strongly of roasted turkey and expensive pine candles, but the atmosphere was suffocating. "I am so glad you decided to be reasonable and join us." "Audrey," Brenda said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Come straight into the formal dining room. We have some guests waiting." I followed her down the wide hallway, and the illusion of a peaceful holiday vanished the second I stepped through the arched doorway. The long mahogany dining table was not set with fine china crystal wine glasses or holiday centerpieces. Instead, 5 people were seated around the bare table in tailored business suits. I recognized 3 of them instantly. They were the senior executive board members of my father's commercial real estate company. They were men who used to smile at me when my father was alive, but now they all stared at me with varying expressions of absolute disdain and impatience. Sitting at the head of the table directly next to Jason was a middle-aged man I had never seen before. He had slicked back, dark hair, a sharp gray suit, and a predatory smirk that made my skin crawl. He had a thick leather briefcase open on the table in front of him, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. Brenda gestured for me to sit in the single empty chair at the opposite end of the table, effectively placing me in front of a corporate firing squad. "Since we are all gathered here today," Brenda announced, placing a hand on Jason's shoulder, "I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to handle some unfortunate family business." "Audrey, this is Mr. Carlson. He is the new corporate attorney representing your brother and the estate." I sat down slowly, pulling my chair in. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany wood, making sure my posture remained entirely relaxed. I knew Agent Reynolds was listening to every single breath. "Happy Thanksgiving to you too, Mother," I said evenly, letting my eyes sweep across the board members before landing on the slick lawyer. I was not aware we were hosting a hostile corporate takeover over the cranberry sauce. Jason leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table. He looked slightly haggard, undoubtedly stressed from Keisha locking him out of their luxury penthouse the day before, but he still wore his signature mask of unearned arrogance. "We are not here to celebrate the holidays," Audrey, Jason snapped, pointing a finger at me. "We are here to clean up the financial mess you made." Mr. Carlson cleared his throat loudly, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked down his nose at me as if I were a common criminal staining the expensive Persian rug. "Ms. Audrey, we represent the primary financial stakeholders of this entire enterprise. Your brother has generously agreed to offer you one final private chance to resolve your massive theft from the family trust fund before we involve the local criminal authorities. You have been a burden on this grieving family since your father passed away. Today that officially ends. Sign over your remaining legal rights right now, or you are leaving this house in handcuffs." Mr. Carlson did not wait for my response. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out legal papers bound by a blue cover. He slid the documents across the polished mahogany table. The thick packet stopped exactly inches from my folded hands. The letters read, "Quitclaim Deed and Release of Claims." I looked slowly down at the legal document, then back up at the corrupt attorney. "You want me to sign a quitclaim deed right before we carve the turkey?" I asked, keeping my tone mild. I projected my voice clearly so the hidden microphone would pick up every syllable. The transmitter captured everything from the ice in Jason's glass to the heating system. Brenda stood up from her chair at the head of the table. She walked slowly toward my end of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She stopped right behind Mr. Carlson, crossing her arms over her pristine white cashmere dress. Her expensive perfume contrasted sickeningly with the threats she was about to deliver. "This is not a negotiation," Audrey Brenda stated, her voice icy and precise. You hacked into your father's private accounts while he was lying in a hospice bed. You transferred $4 million of family money into an offshore account that nobody can locate. That is not just theft. That is felony elder abuse. You took advantage of a dying man. I kept my hands resting quietly on the table. Let me ensure I understand the situation perfectly, Mother, I said, carefully guiding her deeper into the federal trap. You are demanding that I permanently sign away all of my legal rights to my father's commercial real estate company. You are also demanding that I surrender any claim to the $4 million trust fund. That is exactly right, Jason interjected loudly from the other end of the table. He pointed a silver butter knife at me for emphasis. You sign that paper right now, and you walk out of this house with nothing, but you get to keep your freedom. We will generously agree not to press charges. And if I decline your generous holiday offer? I asked, shifting my gaze back to Brenda. Brenda reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out her smartphone. She held it up so the screen faced me. The keypad was already open with the numbers 911 typed in and ready to dial. If you do not pick up that pen and sign the quitclaim deed right this second, I am pressing call. Brenda threatened. I will tell dispatch my daughter stole $4 million from her father. I will tell them you are currently trespassing in my home and refusing to leave. With your bank accounts already frozen by the court, you will not even be able to afford a decent bail bondsman. You will sit in a cold county jail cell through the entire holiday weekend. I looked at the corporate board members seated around the table. They were supposedly respectable businessmen, sitting in silent approval as a mother and son extorted a family member. Do all of you support this strategy? I asked, looking directly at the oldest board member, a man named Richard, who had known my father for 20 years. Are you comfortable acting as witnesses to blatant criminal extortion? Richard shifted uncomfortably in his tailored suit, but he did not look away. Your father wanted Jason to run the company, Audrey, Richard said coldly. We all saw the handwritten will. You are disrupting the corporate transition. Signing that document is the only way to ensure the business survives your selfish financial sabotage. We fully support your mother's decision to involve law enforcement if you refuse to cooperate today. I nodded slowly, absorbing his words. Every single person in this room was entirely complicit. They were all participating in a coordinated effort to blackmail me, using fabricated allegations of elder abuse as leverage. Agent Reynolds was sitting in an unmarked van 3 blocks away, listening to a textbook case of federal extortion unfold in real time. The audio recording was pristine. They were handing me their own prison sentences wrapped in a Thanksgiving bow. I looked down at the quitclaim deed again. Beside the document, Mr. Carlson had placed a heavy gold fountain pen. The room was suffocatingly silent, filled only with the sound of Jason's heavy breathing and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. They were all watching me, just waiting for my spirit to completely break. They expected me to reach for the pen, tears streaming down my face, terrified of going to jail. Instead, I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the cold, calculated smile of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. I did not reach for the heavy gold fountain pen. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest. I decline your offer, I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet dining room. I will not sign the quitclaim deed, and I will certainly not surrender my legal rights to my father's estate just because you managed to intimidate a room full of supposed professionals. Jason's face turned a violent shade of crimson. The vein in his forehead throbbed dangerously. He slammed both hands down on the polished mahogany table, making the crystal water glasses rattle. You arrogant little brat! Jason spat, his voice losing all traces of the composed executive. He pushed his chair back violently, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. He lunged forward, marching down the length of the table toward me, fists clenched at his sides. Jason, calm down, Mr. Carlson warned, standing up quickly. We need to handle this properly. We cannot have an altercation here. Jason ignored the corrupt lawyer entirely. He stopped mere inches from my chair, towering over me. His breath was ragged. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. You are going to pick up that pen and sign the paper right now, Audrey, or I swear I will drag you out of this house by your hair and throw you into the street myself. I am done playing games. Brenda did not intervene. She stood near the head of the table watching with cold approval as her golden child threatened physical violence. The board members shifted uncomfortably, but Richard and the others remained silent, too cowardly to step between us. I did not flinch. I did not shrink away from Jason's towering presence. I simply reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. My father had installed a surround sound system years ago, and Brenda always left the Bluetooth receiver active to play ambient classical music during her dinner parties. It took me exactly 3 seconds to pair my device to the dining room speakers. "What are you doing?" Jason demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Put the phone down. I think the board members deserve to hear exactly why you are so desperate to have me removed from the estate today," I said calmly. I pressed play on the audio file my cyber team had extracted from the hidden laptop Keisha provided. I chose a file that did not expose my federal connections, but completely destroyed Jason's credibility. Jason's own voice boomed from the hidden speakers in the ceiling, amplified to maximum volume. "Yeah, I got the loan extension," handled the recorded version of Jason said, followed by the sound of ice clinking in a glass. "Just back off for 2 more weeks. The old man is basically comatose. I already wrote up the new will myself. I just forged his signature on the bottom line last night. It looks perfect." A second voice answered on the recording, rough and impatient. It was Jason's underground bookie. "You better hope it works, Jason. You owe us 600 grand by the end of the month. If that will gets contested, you are a dead man walking. Do not worry about my sister." Jason's recorded voice laughed arrogantly. "Audrey is a clueless loser. I am setting her up to take the fall for the missing cash anyway. My mom is so blinded by her own ego she will believe whatever I tell her. Once I liquidate the warehouses, you will get your money. Just give me 2 weeks." I tapped the screen of my phone, pausing the playback. The sudden silence in the dining room was deafening. The air in the room felt as if it had been completely sucked out. Jason stood completely frozen beside my chair. All the color drained from his face, leaving him sickly and pale. His fists uncurled at his sides. He stared up at the ceiling speakers in absolute terror, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he tried to process the reality of what had just happened. At the head of the table, Brenda looked like she had been physically struck. Her pristine white cashmere dress suddenly seemed to swallow her. She stared at Jason, eyes wide with shock. The recording had not just exposed his forgery. It exposed his gambling debts and his absolute contempt for her intelligence. He had called her blinded by her ego broadcast to the entire executive board. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair tipping backward and crashing onto the Persian rug. He stared at Jason with absolute disgust. "Is this some kind of joke?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling. "You forged his signature. You lied to the board." Mr. Carlson was already frantically packing his legal documents back into his leather briefcase. He was corrupt, but not suicidal. "I cannot represent you in this matter," Mr. Carlson stammered, backing slowly away from the table. "This firm withdraws its counsel. Retain criminal defense attorneys immediately." He sprinted right out of the dining room. I sat quietly looking up at my brother. The predatory golden child had been reduced to a panicked animal in seconds. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen, examined it briefly, and tossed it at his feet. The heavy gold fountain pen hit the floor with a dull thud, rolling slightly across the expensive Persian rug, before coming to a complete stop right next to Jason's polished leather shoes. He did not even look down. He just kept staring at the ceiling speakers as if the ghost of his own hubris was floating above the dining table. Richard did not wait for an explanation. He grabbed his overcoat from the back of his chair. He pointed a shaking finger at Brenda, who was still standing at the head of the table like a frozen statue. "You are both completely out of your minds," Richard said, his voice thick with disgust. "The board will be convening an emergency meeting first thing Monday morning. Do not expect to retain control of this company, Jason. You will be lucky if we do not hand this recording over to the authorities ourselves." The other two board members hastily followed Richard out of the room, their footsteps echoing rapidly down the hallway. The heavy oak front door slammed shut, signaling the complete collapse of Brenda's carefully orchestrated holiday ambush. The sudden departure of her audience seemed to snap my mother out of her stunned paralysis. But instead of accepting the reality of the situation, Brenda retreated into absolute hysterical denial. She looked at Jason, then at me, her eyes wild and frantic. "That is a fake recording!" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the empty dining room. "You hired someone to fake his voice. You used a computer program to edit those words together. Jason would never do something so stupid. He is the head of this family." Jason finally blinked, looking over at his mother. "Mom, shut up," he muttered, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "Just shut up." But Brenda was completely unhinged. She refused to let her pristine illusion of superiority shatter. She reached for the nearest object on the mahogany table, which happened to be a full crystal wine glass. With a sudden violent sweep of her arm, she hurled the glass against the far wall. It shattered into 100 jagged pieces, sending dark red wine splattering across the expensive floral wallpaper like a crime scene. "I am not letting you destroy us!" Brenda screamed, her face contorted with rage. She snatched her smartphone from the table. "I warned you, Audrey. I told you what would happen if you refused to sign the paperwork." She jabbed her manicured fingers against the screen, dialing 911. She pressed the phone to her ear, her chest heaving as she waited for the dispatcher to answer. I simply stood up from my chair and smoothed the front of my burgundy sweater. I made sure not to brush the hidden microphone taped to my collarbone. Agent Reynolds was getting a spectacular audio feed of a false police report being filed in real time. "Hello, police," Brenda cried out, her voice instantly transforming from vicious rage to the trembling, terrified tone of a helpless victim. "Yes, I need officers at my residence immediately. My daughter has broken into my home. She is trespassing. She is violently destroying my property and threatening my son. She is trying to extort us. Please hurry, we are terrified for our lives." She gave the dispatcher our address, her fake tears flowing freely now. She hung up the phone and glared at me with pure, unfiltered malice. "They are sending patrol cars right now," she hissed, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "You are going to be arrested for assault and trespassing, Audrey. With your bank accounts frozen, you will rot in a holding cell all weekend. Nobody will ever believe your ridiculous fake audio recording over a bruised, terrified mother." I looked at the shattered crystal and the red wine dripping down the wallpaper. It was a pathetic, desperate display. They had lost the board of directors. They had lost their corrupt lawyer. Jason had essentially confessed to felony fraud on tape. And yet Brenda still thought she could manipulate the legal system by throwing a violent tantrum and crying wolf to the local police department. I walked slowly around the mahogany table, making sure to keep a safe distance from both of them. I picked up my heavy winter coat from the chair near the doorway and casually draped it over my arm. "You are making a terrible mistake leaving right now." Jason suddenly spoke up, trying to regain a sliver of his false bravado. "Running away makes you look incredibly guilty to the cops." I paused in the arched doorway of the dining room. From the distance, the faint, high-pitched wail of police sirens began to cut through the quiet suburban neighborhood. The local precinct was only 2 miles away. They would be pulling into the driveway in less than a minute. "I am not running away, Jason," I said calmly, looking back at the two of them standing amidst the ruins of their extortion attempt. "I am simply letting you explain the broken glass to the officers all by yourselves." Brenda opened her mouth to scream another threat, but the sirens grew significantly louder, echoing down the street and approaching the front gates of the estate. I turned my back on them and walked steadily down the wide hallway. "See you at the depositions, Mother," I called out over my shoulder. I opened the heavy oak front door, just as the flashing red and blue lights of 2 police cruisers swept across the manicured lawn. I walked down the stone steps completely unbothered, stepping aside as 4 officers rushed toward the house. I got into my unremarkable gray sedan, started the engine without hesitation, and drove away quietly into the dark, incredibly cold Thanksgiving night, leaving them trapped in their own manufactured chaos. The fallout from Thanksgiving night was predictably pathetic. The local police officers arrived at the estate only to find a shattered crystal wine glass, and a hysterical woman spinning wild tales of a violent daughter who was already long gone. With no physical evidence of an assault, and Jason refusing to back up his mother's frantic story out of sheer embarrassment, the officers left with a stern warning about wasting city resources. But the real humiliation for my brother was just beginning. It was Wednesday afternoon, exactly one day before we were scheduled to sit for our sworn legal depositions. Brenda, desperate to project an image of absolute stability after the corporate board members walked out on her, had organized a lavish luncheon at the Oak Ridge Country Club. She invited the most influential women in her social circle, sitting at a prime table on the outdoor terrace overlooking the pristine golf course. Jason sat beside her, nervously picking at his expensive steak. He was trying to maintain the facade of a successful executive, but the dark circles under his eyes told a different story. He had spent the last 5 days locked out of his penthouse, living in Brenda's guest room and dodging furious phone calls from his underground bookie. At precisely 1 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the terrace swung open. Keisha walked out into the crisp afternoon air. She wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that screamed authority. She did not look like a grieving wife or a woman whose marriage was falling apart. She looked like a corporate assassin. Walking right beside her was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a plain beige trench coat. He was a registered court process server. The terrace grew remarkably quiet as Keisha navigated through the maze of white linen tables. Several of Brenda's wealthy friends paused with their champagne flutes halfway to their mouths, watching the dramatic approach. Brenda noticed the sudden silence and turned around. Her polite smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic. "Keisha, what on earth are you doing here?" Brenda hissed, keeping her voice low but frantic. "You are not appropriately dressed for the terrace, and we are in the middle of a private lunch." Keisha ignored her mother-in-law completely. She stopped directly behind Jason's chair. Jason looked up, his face paling instantly. Before he could even open his mouth to offer a pathetic apology or demand that she leave, Keisha nodded to the man standing next to her. Jason, the man in the trench coat, said loudly, his voice easily carrying across the quiet terrace. He pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his jacket pocket and dropped them squarely onto Jason's plate, right on top of his expensive steak. "You have officially been served." Gasps echoed from the surrounding tables. Brenda covered her mouth in absolute horror. Serving legal papers in the middle of the Oak Ridge Country Club was the ultimate social cardinal sin. It was messy, public, and entirely undeniable. "What is this?" Jason stammered, staring down at the thick manila envelope ruining his lunch. "Those are your divorce papers," Keisha announced, her voice ringing out clear and steady for every wealthy socialite to hear. "I filed them first thing Monday morning under the grounds of irreconcilable differences and extreme financial misconduct. I also included a copy of the emergency financial injunction the judge signed an hour ago." Jason scrambled to open the envelope, his hands shaking violently. He scanned the front page, his eyes widening in absolute terror. "You froze my accounts," he choked out, looking up at her in disbelief. "You cannot do that. I need that money to pay my obligations. Every single joint account, investment portfolio, and shared credit line is completely locked down," Keisha confirmed coldly. "The judge granted the freeze based on documented evidence of your illegal offshore wire transfers. You cannot touch a single dime of my money, Jason, and the penthouse is legally mine. If you ever try to step foot in my building again, you will be arrested for trespassing." Brenda stood up, her face flushed with rage and embarrassment. She looked frantically around at her wealthy friends, who were all watching the spectacle with wide eyes. "Keisha, lower your voice immediately," Brenda demanded. You are making a scene. We can handle this privately like civilized people. You lost the right to privacy the moment you threatened my career, Brenda Keisha replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact. Enjoy your lunch. Both of you are going to need the energy for court tomorrow. Keisha turned on her heel and walked away, her head held high, leaving Jason hyperventilating over his ruined steak and Brenda completely disgraced in front of the only people whose opinions she actually cared about. The morning after Keisha dismantled Jason at the country club, a heavy rain washed over the city. It was Thursday, the day of our sworn legal depositions. I walked into the sterile, brightly lit conference room of a neutral downtown law firm wearing a simple beige cardigan and a modest skirt. I deliberately dressed down, playing the part of the meek, unemployed daughter my family so desperately wanted me to be. Mr. Cohen. My attorney sat beside me, organizing his legal pads with quiet precision. Across the long, polished conference table sat Brenda and Jason, flanked by their hastily hired new defense attorney, a stern-looking woman named Ms. Bennett. Jason looked physically ill, his eyes darting around the room, completely broken by the impending divorce and the frozen assets. Brenda, however, sat perfectly straight. She wore a tailored navy blazer and her signature pearls, her chin tilted upward in a display of unyielding arrogance. She was furious about the public humiliation yesterday, and her eyes locked onto me with pure, concentrated hatred. She was ready to destroy me on the official record. At the head of the table, a court stenographer set up her typing machine, and a videographer adjusted a camera mounted on a tripod. The red recording light clicked on. Every single word spoken in this room from this moment forward was bound by the penalty of perjury. Ms. Bennett began by establishing my background, probing for weaknesses. State your name and current occupation for the record, she demanded, barely looking up from her legal pad. Audrey, I replied quietly, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. I do some independent data consulting from home. Brenda let out a loud, patronizing scoff. She is unemployed, Brenda interrupted, leaning toward the microphone. She sits in her apartment all day. She has no real career, which is exactly why she had to steal from her own family. Mr. Cohen calmly raised a hand. Let us allow the witness to finish, Ms. Bennett, or we can conclude this deposition right now. Ms. Bennett silenced Brenda with a sharp look and moved on, having established the narrative she wanted on the official transcript. After 30 minutes of mundane procedural questions designed to make me look financially unstable, it was Brenda's turn to speak. The court reporter asked Brenda to raise her right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury? The reporter asked. I do, Brenda stated proudly, completely oblivious to the trap closing around her. Ms. Bennett guided Brenda through her fabricated timeline, asking her to describe the days immediately following my father's death. Brenda was in her element. She performed beautifully for the camera, dabbing at her dry eyes, playing the grieving widow whose trust had been violated by a greedy child. And can you describe to the room exactly how the $4 million trust fund was stolen? Ms. Bennett asked gently, teeing up the scripted lie. Brenda took a deep, steadying breath, looking directly into the camera lens. It was late at night, 2 days after Thomas passed. I could not sleep, so I went downstairs to his home office. The door was slightly ajar. I looked inside, and I saw Audrey sitting at his desk. What was she doing? Ms. Bennett prompted. She was logged into his secure laptop, Brenda swore under oath. I watched her typing furiously. I stood right there in the doorway and personally witnessed her navigating the banking portal. I saw the transfer confirmation screen flash on the monitor. She sent $4 million to a hidden offshore account, and then she quickly shut the computer down when she heard me gasp. Mr. Cohen leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He looked at Brenda with mild curiosity. Just to be absolutely clear for the record, Brenda, you are stating under the penalty of perjury that you personally witnessed Audrey operating Thomas's laptop and transferring the funds. Yes, Brenda answered firmly, her tone dripping with righteous indignation. I saw her do it with my own 2 eyes. Are you certain it was not a scheduled transfer? Mr. Cohen pressed gently. Memory can be tricky during times of intense grief. I know exactly what I saw. Brenda snapped, glaring at my lawyer. Do not try to confuse me. My daughter stole that money. She is a thief. Mr. Cohen simply nodded and made a small check mark on his yellow legal pad. Thank you, Brenda. That is very clear. I kept my eyes fixed on the table, hiding the cold satisfaction pooling in my chest. Brenda had just handed us the rope to hang her with. She had explicitly sworn to witnessing a crime that never happened, involving a laptop that was currently sitting in a secure federal evidence locker. Thomas had handed that laptop over to the agency months ago. The machine had been wiped and dismantled by our cyber division long before my father even entered hospice care. It was physically impossible for me to have used it that night, and I had the federal chain of custody documents to prove it. Brenda thought she was driving the final nail into my coffin. She had absolutely no idea she had just committed a textbook federal felony on tape. Brenda settled back into her leather chair, looking incredibly pleased with herself. She adjusted her tailored navy blazer, believing she had delivered the final blow to my credibility. The court reporter's fingers paused over the keys, the silence in the room heavy with the weight of Brenda's absolute perjury. Ms. Bennett offered her client a small approving nod before turning her attention to the man sitting beside her. Jason, it is your turn, Ms. Bennett said, gesturing toward the microphone positioned in the center of the table. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The dark circles under his eyes seemed pronounced under the harsh fluorescent lights. He was visibly sweating, his collar clinging to his neck. The financial devastation Keisha dropped on him at the club was taking a physical toll. Still, his arrogance ran deep. He cleared his throat, sat up straight, and tried to project the commanding presence of a wealthy corporate executive. The court reporter asked him to raise his right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, under penalty of perjury? I do, Jason stated, his voice cracking slightly on the first syllable before he forced it into a deeper register. Ms. Bennett began with the exact same gentle leading tone she had used with my mother. She needed to establish Jason's absolute legal authority over the estate to justify their hostile takeover of my father's commercial empire. Jason, can you please describe the circumstances surrounding your father's final will and testament? Ms. Bennett asked. Jason leaned into the microphone. 2 days before my father passed away, he asked to speak with me privately in his hospital room. He was fully lucid. He sat up in his bed and told me he had made a terrible mistake, trusting Audrey with any portion of his legacy. He dictated a new will to me right then and there. I wrote it down exactly as he requested, and he signed it himself. Were there any other witnesses present in the room when he signed this document, Ms. Bennett prompted, carefully avoiding the legal requirement for notarization by painting it as a desperate dying wish. No, Jason answered smoothly, growing more confident with his own lie. We were entirely alone. He wanted it kept strictly between the two of us until after he was gone. I kept my face completely blank, but internally, I was marveling at the sheer magnitude of his stupidity. 2 days before my father died, he was in the intensive care unit. He was heavily sedated, hooked to a ventilator, and physically incapable of speaking, let alone sitting up and signing a legal document. My federal team already possessed the certified medical records and the sworn affidavits from the attending nurses, proving Thomas was completely incapacitated. Jason had just sworn under oath that a comatose man had dictated a complex legal strategy to him. Ms. Bennett flipped a page on her legal pad. And regarding the company finances, Jason, have you noticed any irregularities since taking over the executive duties? Jason let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, pointing an accusing finger directly at me. The trust fund is completely gone. Audrey drained $4 million from the family reserves. I have been desperately trying to keep the commercial properties afloat, but she crippled our operating budget with her theft. Thank you, Jason, Ms. Bennett said, leaning back in her chair with a satisfied smile. I have no further questions at this time. Mr. Cohen adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. He did not look angry. He looked like a teacher about to correct a very slow student. Just a few clarifying questions for the record, Jason. Jason crossed his arms, adopting a defensive, hostile posture. Go ahead. Mr. Cohen looked down at his yellow notepad. You just testified that you are desperately trying to keep the commercial properties afloat. Have you at any point in the last 2 years transferred company funds or liquidated real estate assets into offshore accounts? Absolutely not. Jason scoffed, his eyes darting briefly toward the camera lens. Every single dollar has stayed within the domestic operating accounts of the business. Mr. Cohen did not miss a beat. So you have absolutely no knowledge of an offshore entity operating out of the Cayman Islands under the name Apex Holdings Group. Jason swallowed hard. A visible bead of sweat rolled down his temple. The mention of the specific shell company rattled him, but he was in too deep to back out now. I have never heard of that company. Jason swore, his voice rising in panic. I never funneled money out of the country. I sat quietly watching him seal his own fate. Every single word was a documented felony lie. Mr. Cohen did not press the issue immediately. He simply nodded his head slowly, allowing Jason's aggressive denial to echo in the quiet conference room. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, immortalizing the perjury. Ms. Bennett, the defense attorney, let out a small, satisfied breath, clearly believing her client had successfully deflected a desperate fishing expedition. Brenda leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with a triumphant smirk. They both thought the danger had passed. Mr. Cohen flipped to the very last page of his yellow legal pad. He adjusted his glasses, squinting slightly at his own handwriting as if he were trying to decipher a minor, insignificant detail. Just one final question for you, Jason, and then we can wrap up this deposition for the day. My client and I certainly do not want to take up any more of your valuable time. Jason rolled his shoulders, eager to escape the hot seat. He checked his expensive gold watch, a blatant display of disrespect. Make it quick, he demanded. I have a company to run. Mr. Cohen looked up, his expression entirely benign. I am looking at a copy of a domestic wire transfer request that was flagged in the company ledgers. It is a rather large sum connected to the sale of the downtown commercial warehouse last month. The routing number listed on the destination account ends in 4782. Does that specific sequence of numbers mean anything to you? Jason froze. The arrogant slouch vanished from his posture. That routing number was not just a random sequence. It was the exact numerical identifier for Apex Holdings Group, the Cayman Islands shell company he had fraudulently established using Keisha's forged signature. It was the exact routing number Keisha had handed over to me on the secure flash drive in the underground parking garage. I watched Jason's throat bob as he swallowed hard. He glanced quickly at Ms. Bennett, but she was busy packing her legal briefs into her briefcase, completely unaware of the explosive nature of the question. Jason knew that if he admitted to recognizing the number, he would be linking himself directly to the offshore account he had just sworn he knew nothing about. But if he denied it, he was banking on the hope that we did not have the physical proof to contradict him. Jason, always the gambler, doubled down on the lie. That is just a clerical error, Jason scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. He forced a harsh, patronizing laugh that sounded incredibly hollow in the sterile room. My soon-to-be ex-wife runs a very sloppy real estate brokerage. Her assistant probably just typed the wrong account destination into the portal. We caught the mistake before the funds were ever moved. It means absolutely nothing to me or the company. Mr. Cohen leaned forward, his voice perfectly level. So you are stating under oath that routing number 4782 is a clerical error made by Vanguard Luxury Real Estate, and that you personally never authorized or executed a wire transfer to that destination. I never authorized it. Jason snapped, his voice rising in defensive anger. Like I said, it was a mistake made by Keisha's incompetent staff. I do not know whose account that is, and no company money was ever sent there. Now are we done here? Mr. Cohen held Jason's gaze for a long, silent moment. The tension in the room spiked, but the defense attorney remained entirely oblivious. Finally, Mr. Cohen closed his yellow legal pad and capped his pen. "We are done, Jason. Thank you for your profound honesty." Mr. Cohen turned his head slightly toward me. We did not smile. We did not high-five. We simply exchanged a single imperceptible look. The trap was completely locked. The heavy steel doors had slammed shut, and my family was standing right in the center of the cage. They had just committed federal perjury, fraud, and defamation on a recorded government transcript. Ms. Bennett stood up briskly, looking incredibly pleased with her work. "This concludes the deposition," she announced to the room. "We will see you in federal court next week for the formal hearing, Mr. Cohen. I highly suggest you advise your client to consider a settlement before the judge hands down a criminal referral." "We will certainly take your advice under advisement, Ms. Bennett," Mr. Cohen replied politely, packing his briefcase. Brenda stood up, smoothing her navy blazer. She looked down at me with absolute disgust. "You really thought you could outsmart us, Audrey," she sneered. "You are going to lose everything." I stood up slowly, pushing my chair in. I looked at my mother and then at my older brother. "See you in federal court," I said softly. Exactly 1 week later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut behind me, sealing us inside the grand architecture of the legal system. The transition to the imposing federal courtroom was jarring for my mother and brother, though they tried to hide their anxiety. We were finally here. We were back to the exact moment this entire story began. I sat quietly at the defense table next to Mr. Cohen. Across the aisle, Brenda was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She was seated on the witness stand, dabbing her dry eyes with her monogrammed silk handkerchief. She was doubling down on the exact same lies she had sworn to during the deposition. She has not worked a single day since graduating college. Brenda sobbed into the microphone, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "My daughter is a parasite, Your Honor. She hacked into my late husband's trust fund and stole $4 million from her own family." I watched her carefully. Knowing what I knew now, her performance was not just pathetic, it was legally suicidal. During the deposition, she had locked herself into a fabricated narrative. Now she was repeating those lies in a federal courtroom in front of a federal judge, completely unaware that the trap had already snapped shut around her ankle. Behind me in the gallery, Jason leaned forward. His expensive Italian suit looked slightly loose on his frame. The stress of Keisha freezing his assets and kicking him out of the penthouse was taking a visible toll. Yet he still managed to look arrogant, resting his chin on his hands, playing the role of the devastated golden child. He thought the routing number blunder from the deposition was just a minor hurdle his lawyer could easily suppress. Judge Mitchell peered over his reading glasses. His expression was stern and unreadable as he looked down at me. "Does the defense have anything to say about these severe allegations?" Judge Mitchell asked, his voice booming through the quiet room. "Ms. Audrey is facing a criminal referral if these claims hold any merit whatsoever." This was it. The culmination of months of silent investigation, the payoff for enduring every insult, every eviction threat, and every stolen dollar. Mr. Cohen stood up slowly. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate calm. He reached down to our table and picked up the thick manila envelope. The heavy red wax seal on the back, stamped with the official insignia of the United States government, caught the harsh fluorescent light. "We do, Your Honor," Mr. Cohen said calmly. "We have a single document that will clarify the exact location of the $4 million, as well as my client's current employment status, which the plaintiff seems to be so terribly confused about." Brenda let out a sharp, mocking laugh from the witness stand. "Employment status," she sneered loudly, abandoning her grieving widow act for a second of pure spite. "She sits in her apartment all day staring at a computer screen. She is a thief." Mr. Cohen ignored her completely. He stepped out from behind the heavy wooden table and extended his hand. The armed bailiff approached, taking the sealed envelope from my lawyer. The sound of the bailiff's boots echoing across the floor was the only noise. Every eye tracked the movement of that envelope. The bailiff climbed the short wooden steps and handed the envelope directly to Judge Mitchell. I watched my mother's face. The smug satisfaction began to drain from her features, replaced by a sudden creeping uncertainty. She glanced back at Jason in the gallery. Jason sat up straight, his hands dropping from his chin, his eyes locked on the thick red seal. He recognized that it was not a standard legal brief. Ms. Bennett sat frozen at the plaintiff table. She looked up at the judge, trying to read his sudden change in posture. As a seasoned attorney, she knew that when a federal judge stopped reading and leaned forward with that specific intensity, someone in the room was about to face devastating consequences. She quickly looked back at Brenda, her professional confidence wavering for the very first time. Judge Mitchell took the envelope. He inspected the red wax seal, his eyebrows shooting up in genuine surprise. He slid a silver letter opener under the flap. The sharp cracking of the wax echoed loudly as he pulled out the thick stack of papers. As his eyes scanned the first page, the atmosphere in the room shifted violently. The mild annoyance Judge Mitchell had displayed earlier vanished entirely. He sat back in his large leather chair, completely engrossed in the federal document. The air grew incredibly cold. Brenda shifted uncomfortably on the wooden bench, her fake tears completely gone. Jason shifted his weight, the gallery wood creaking loudly. I kept my eyes locked on my mother, offering a small, icy smile. The game was officially over. Judge Mitchell did not just skim the document. He read every single line of the first page, his eyes darting back and forth across the thick black text. Then he slowly turned to the second page. The silence in the federal courtroom became physically oppressive. Nobody dared to cough. Nobody dared to whisper. The court reporter suspended her hands above her keyboard, waiting for someone to break the deafening quiet. The heavy ticking of the wall clock sounded like a countdown to absolute destruction. I watched Ms. Bennett closely. She was a defense attorney who relied heavily on preparation, and she suddenly realized she had walked blindfolded into a minefield. She leaned over the plaintiff table, desperately trying to catch a glimpse of the red seal on the discarded envelope resting near the judge. When she recognized the insignia of the United States Treasury Department, all the color drained from her face. She slowly sat back down, creating a subtle but deliberate physical distance between herself and the empty chair where my mother usually sat. She was already mentally drafting her withdrawal of counsel. Brenda was still seated on the witness stand, but her confident posture was rapidly crumbling. She gripped the edges of the wooden railing so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. She looked at Judge Mitchell, waiting for him to validate her tearful performance. She expected him to slam his gavel down, point a furious finger at me, and order my immediate arrest. Instead, the judge did not even look at her. He was too focused on the undeniable federal evidence exposing her lies. In the gallery behind me, the creaking of the wooden benches stopped. Jason sat perfectly still, completely paralyzed by the shifting power dynamic. The arrogance that had fueled his entire hostile takeover was gone, replaced by the primal fear of a cornered animal. He knew about the fake routing number he had denied under oath. He knew about the forged will, but up until this exact second, he honestly believed his money and our family name would insulate him from any real consequences. He looked toward the heavy oak doors, calculating how fast he could run, but the armed bailiff was already blocking the exit. Judge Mitchell reached the final page of the document. He read the official signatures at the bottom. He let out a long, heavy exhale that echoed through the courtroom microphones. He slowly aligned the edges of the papers, tapping them gently against the mahogany bench. The judge reached up and removed his reading glasses, folding the frames with a sharp, deliberate click. The sound made Brenda jump slightly in her seat. Judge Mitchell leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, and finally directed his stern gaze toward the witness stand. He did not look at my mother with sympathy. He looked at her with the absolute profound disgust reserved for the lowest caliber of criminals. Mrs. Brenda, Judge Mitchell, began, his voice dangerously low and resonant. You sat in my courtroom today, placed your right hand on a Bible, and swore under the penalty of perjury to tell the truth. You testified that you personally witnessed your daughter stealing $4 million. You testified that she is an unemployed parasite, draining your family resources. Brenda swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. Yes, Your Honor. she whispered, her voice trembling violently as her false narrative collapsed. Because it is the truth. Judge Mitchell slammed his open palm flat against the mahogany desk. The sudden explosive sound resembled a gunshot, causing both Brenda and Jason to physically flinch. It is a complete fabrication, Judge Mitchell roared, his voice booming through the speakers and rattling the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. You have weaponized the federal legal system to execute a malicious, coordinated fraud. The document I am holding in my hands is a certified, unredacted employment verification and financial disclosure file directly from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Brenda gasped, her eyes widening in absolute terror. She looked over at me, finally understanding why I had never panicked, why I had never cried, and why I had let her freeze my civilian bank accounts without a single fight. Ms. Bennett stood up instantly, raising both hands in a gesture of complete surrender. Your Honor, please let the record reflect that I had absolutely no prior knowledge of my clients providing false testimony. I was retained strictly for a civil trust dispute. Sit down, Ms. Bennett, Judge Mitchell commanded sharply. You can explain your lack of due diligence to the ethics board later. Right now this court has a much more pressing matter to handle. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He looked past Brenda, past the plaintiff table, and locked eyes with the armed bailiff standing near the back doors of the courtroom. The air in the room stood entirely still. This civil trial is officially suspended. Judge Mitchell declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. He slammed the gavel down onto the sounding block. The loud crack sealed my family's fate permanently. Court is in recess, Judge Mitchell announced. Security, send the agents in. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. 3 figures stepped through the threshold, moving with authoritative precision. 2 tall men wearing dark suits walked in first, their gold FBI badges clearly visible on their belts. Right behind them was a woman wearing a tactical vest bearing the bold yellow letters IRSCI. It was Special Agent Reynolds' primary field team. The armed agents bypassed the spectator benches entirely and marched straight down the center aisle. They positioned themselves strategically between the witness stand and the heavy wooden exit doors. The message was unmistakable. Nobody was leaving this room. Brenda stopped breathing. Her hands remained rigidly gripped around the wooden railing of the witness box. Her eyes darted wildly from the armed agents to Judge Mitchell and finally down to me. The sheer confusion on her face was almost pitiful. She simply could not process the reality unfolding in front of her. In her mind, federal agents only raided the homes of common criminals, not wealthy suburban socialites who belonged to the Oak Ridge Country Club. Jason, sitting in the gallery, understood the gravity of the situation much faster than his mother. He tried to stand up, perhaps driven by some primal instinct to flee, but his legs completely betrayed him. He collapsed back onto the hard wooden bench with a heavy thud, his face draining of all remaining color. He stared at the FBI agents, his jaw hanging slightly open, realizing that every single arrogant threat he had made over the past 3 months had been recorded by the federal government. Judge Mitchell picked up the certified federal document again, holding it up so everyone could see the official Treasury seal. Let the record reflect the contents of this federal decree, Judge Mitchell projected his voice loudly. The plaintiff. Brenda has repeatedly testified that the defendant, Audrey, is an unemployed individual with no professional standing. The plaintiff has used this fabricated narrative to secure emergency financial injunctions and to allege a massive theft. Judge Mitchell lowered the document and looked directly at Brenda. You could not possibly be more wrong about your own daughter. The judge began to read directly from the certified paperwork. The defendant, Audrey, is not unemployed. She is a highly decorated active-duty senior forensic accountant operating for the United States Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. She holds a top-secret federal security clearance, She has spent the last 7 years dismantling international money laundering syndicates, corporate embezzlement rings, and offshore tax evasion schemes. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom gallery. Even the bailiff raised his eyebrows in surprise. I remained perfectly still at the defense table. I did not gloat. I did not smirk. I simply watched my mother's entire worldview shatter into a million jagged pieces. For 33 years, Brenda had constructed her identity around being superior to me. She had actively cultivated the lie that I was a massive disappointment, a failure who could not survive without her charity. She had used that lie to justify her emotional abuse, her blatant favoritism of Jason, and her ultimate attempt to leave me homeless. Now a federal judge was publicly reading my resume into the permanent legal record, exposing me as a top-tier investigator who wielded the power of the United States government. "You lied under oath to frame a federal agent," Judge Mitchell continued, his tone absolutely ruthless. "You filed a fraudulent police report on Thanksgiving night. You illegally froze the civilian bank accounts of an active investigator, attempting to financially suffocate her while she was conducting a sanctioned operation. You and your son have treated this court and the law itself as a tool for your own personal greed." Brenda shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, that is impossible. She just sits in her room. She does not do anything important. It is a mistake." "It is not a mistake," Mrs. Brenda, Judge Mitchell stated firmly. "The only mistake made here was your profound underestimation of the woman sitting across from you." Ms. Bennett, the defense attorney, slowly slid her chair away from the plaintiff table. She looked at me with absolute terror, realizing she had aggressively deposed an undercover federal accountant. Jason buried his face in his trembling hands, the reality of his Cayman Islands wire transfers crashing down upon him. He had not just stolen from our father. He had executed a massive financial crime right in front of the Internal Revenue Service. Brenda looked desperately toward her son for backup, but Jason refused to lift his head. The golden boy was completely broken. The pristine facade of their wealthy suburban life had been violently ripped away. The pristine facade of their wealthy suburban life had been violently ripped away. But Judge Mitchell was not finished. He turned to the third page of the federal document, the heavy paper rustling loudly. "If my mother and brother thought my true identity was the most devastating revelation of the day, they were completely unprepared for the reality of the $4 million they had been so desperate to reclaim." Regarding the specific $4 million trust fund at the center of this civil lawsuit, Judge Mitchell announced, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "The plaintiff has repeatedly testified that the defendant stole this money while the late Thomas was incapacitated. The plaintiff has demanded the immediate return of these funds to the estate." Brenda looked up, a tiny pathetic glimmer of hope sparking in her tear-filled eyes. She still somehow believed that because the money was missing, she was legally entitled to it. She thought her husband belonged to her and therefore his wealth was hers to control. "Your husband was not a foolish man, Mrs. Brenda," Judge Mitchell stated coldly, extinguishing that final spark of hope instantly. 6 months before he entered hospice care, Thomas discovered a massive discrepancy in his commercial real estate ledgers. He realized that his own son, with the passive complicity of his wife, was actively embezzling millions of dollars to pay off underground gambling debts. Jason let out a choked, guttural sound, his face still buried in his hands. "Instead of confronting you and giving you the opportunity to hide the stolen assets," Judge Mitchell continued reading from my father's sworn federal affidavit attached to the file. "Thomas bypassed his corporate attorneys entirely. He went directly to the Internal Revenue Service. He sat down with his daughter, a sworn federal investigator, and handed over complete access to his financial empire." Brenda shook her head violently. "No, Thomas would never do that. He loved Jason. He wanted Jason to take over the company. He wanted his legacy protected from criminals," the judge fired back. "Thomas authorized the Internal Revenue Service to establish a classified sting operation." The $4 million you are currently suing to recover was not stolen by Audrey. It was transferred by Thomas himself, with full federal oversight, into a heavily protected United States Treasury account. The sheer weight of the revelation crashed over the plaintiff table. They had spent months accusing me of a vicious crime. They had ostracized me, evicted me, and publicly humiliated me. But in reality, I had been carrying out my father's dying wish. Thomas had spent his final days working alongside me to build an ironclad federal case against the two people who were bleeding him dry. My father loved me enough to trust me with the absolute truth. "Do you understand the magnitude of bringing this civil suit?" Judge Mitchell asked, leaning over the bench. "You did not just file a frivolous lawsuit against your daughter. You filed a fraudulent legal claim demanding that the United States government hand over federally protected sting operation funds. You sued the federal government to recover the exact money you were attempting to launder." Ms. Bennett slowly packed her briefcase and stood up, walking away to stand against the far wall. She wanted no physical proximity to the federal crimes sitting in those chairs. She abandoned her clients without a single word of comfort. "You handed this court a forged will, Judge." Mitchell boomed, his anger completely unfiltered now. "You committed perjury on a recorded legal transcript. You attempted to extort a federal agent with a false police report. And you did all of this while actively funneling domestic real estate profits into a Cayman Islands shell company under the forged signature of an innocent woman." Jason finally raised his head. He looked at the two FBI agents standing in the aisle, their hands resting comfortably near their holstered weapons. He looked at the IRS officer standing near the exit. There was no slick corporate lawyer who could talk him out of this. There was no bribe he could pay and no lie he could spin. He had walked right into a federal courtroom and handed the judge a signed confession to multiple felonies. Brenda reached out, her trembling fingers grabbing the wooden edge of the witness stand. "But I am his wife," she cried out, her voice cracking in absolute desperation. "Half of everything he owned belongs to me by law. You cannot just take it all away. You forfeited your marital rights the moment you actively participated in the financial destruction of his estate." Judge Mitchell replied, showing zero mercy. "The federal government has already seized the remaining commercial properties. Your bank accounts are frozen pending a forfeiture hearing. You have absolutely nothing left." The echo of Judge Mitchell's words hung in the air like a physical weight. Brenda stared at him, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, unable to articulate the absolute ruin that had just consumed her entire existence. She had spent decades building an impenetrable fortress of wealth, status, and casual cruelty, only to watch it vaporize in a matter of seconds inside a federal courtroom. Judge Mitchell did not offer a single shred of sympathy. He looked past her to the armed personnel waiting in the center aisle. "Execute the arrest warrants," he commanded, simply, his voice devoid of any emotion. The two FBI agents and the IRS criminal investigation officer moved simultaneously. Their heavy boots thudded against the polished hardwood floor, a synchronized march of federal authority that shattered the remaining silence. One FBI agent approached the gallery where Jason was sitting. The other, alongside the IRS officer, flanked the witness stand where my mother remained entirely frozen in shock. Jason did not put up a fight. The golden boy, the ruthless corporate executive who had violently threatened to drag me out of my childhood home by my hair, offered absolutely no resistance. When the agent grabbed his shoulder and hauled him to his feet, Jason was completely limp. He kept his eyes glued to the floorboards, his shoulders hunched in profound, humiliating defeat. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting around his wrists echoed sharply through the large room. The sound was the final, undeniable punctuation on his failed criminal career. He was instantly stripped of his custom Italian suit's power, reduced to nothing more than a common white-collar criminal headed for central processing. Brenda, however, refused to go quietly. When the IRS officer reached for her arm to guide her out of the witness box, the shock finally wore off, replaced immediately by raw, unfiltered panic. "Do not touch me!" Brenda shrieked, recoiling violently as if she had been physically burned. "You cannot do this. I am a respected member of this community. I am the widow of Thomas. I have a pristine reputation. Ma'am, place your hands behind your back, the officer instructed, her tone professionally, bored completely immune to the desperate hysterics of a country club socialite. Brenda thrashed wildly, her expensive pearls clattering against the heavy wooden railing of the stand. She tried to swat the officer away, a desperate and incredibly foolish escalation. The FBI agent stepped in immediately, firmly grabbing her wrists and pulling them behind her back with practiced, overwhelming efficiency. Brenda gasped loudly as the cold steel cuffs locked tightly around her bare skin. The clicking mechanism sounded incredibly loud, a terrifying, irreversible noise that signaled the absolute end of her freedom and her lavish lifestyle. The physical reality of the metal restraints broke her completely. The manicured, arrogant matriarch vanished. Brenda's knees buckled underneath her. She collapsed right there on the floor of the federal courtroom, the expensive fabric of her tailored navy blazer gathering dust from the floorboards. She dragged the two agents down slightly, with her sudden dead weight thrashing and sobbing uncontrollably like a petulant child. She twisted her head around her tear-streaked face, searching the room frantically until her wild eyes locked onto me. I was still standing calmly at the defense table watching the spectacular collapse of her empire with the detached, clinical observation of a seasoned federal agent. "Audrey!" She screamed, her voice cracking in absolute agony, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings. "Audrey, please, you have to stop them right now. Tell them it is a massive misunderstanding. Tell them we can pay the money back today. You have the power to fix this. You work for them." I did not move a single inch. I looked down at the woman who had publicly humiliated me at my father's funeral reception, who had actively tried to leave me homeless and penniless, who had laughed out loud while threatening to send me to a cold county jail cell over the holiday weekend. "Please," Brenda begged, her voice degrading into a pathetic, guttural wail. Her expensive mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, ugly black streaks, ruining her perfect makeup. "I am your mother. You cannot let them take your own mother away. Have some mercy on your family." The entire courtroom held its collective breath. Even the federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, waiting to see if the inherent family bond would somehow force me to intervene on her behalf. But there was no bond left to break. They had severed it permanently the exact moment they decided my father's legacy was just a bank account waiting to be drained. I looked down at her with zero emotion. My voice was calm, steady, and entirely devoid of pity when I finally delivered the final blow. "You were never a mother," I said clearly, making sure every single syllable reached her ears over her own sobbing. "You were just a liability. Enjoy federal prison." Brenda let out a devastating, breathless gasp, realizing the absolute finality of my words. There would be no rescue. There would be no second chances. The agents hauled her back to her feet, completely ignoring her frantic, continuous crying. They dragged her down the center aisle, parading her past the empty plaintiff table, past her stunned former attorney, and out toward the exit. Jason followed right behind her, his head bowed, entirely silent as he walked toward his new reality. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, abruptly cutting off the sound of Brenda's hysterical screaming. The federal courtroom fell perfectly quiet once again. Justice had been served exactly as my father intended. I turned back to the defense table, snapped my briefcase shut, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. 6 months later, the bright afternoon sun had given way to a crisp, vibrant autumn. The transition was not just seasonal. The heavy, suffocating shadow my mother and brother had cast over my entire existence had finally evaporated, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of absolute peace. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding inevitability, but when it finally crushes its targets, it leaves absolutely nothing behind. The sentencing hearings were brief, clinical, and completely devoid of any country club theatrics. Jason stood before the federal magistrate, stripped of his custom-tailored Italian suits and forced into standard-issue prison khaki. Without his illegal offshore accounts, his forged documents, and his wealthy mother, to shield him from consequence, his arrogance completely dissolved. He looked small, pale, and thoroughly defeated. He formally pled guilty to multiple counts of international wire fraud, felony forgery, and corporate embezzlement. The judge showed zero leniency, handing down a devastating 10-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary. Brenda fared no better. Her desperate, pathetic attempts to play the naive, grieving widow fell apart entirely under the crushing weight of the surveillance audio recordings and the undeniable perjury from her sworn deposition. The judge explicitly condemned her malicious use of emergency injunctions and false police reports. She was sentenced to 7 years in a federal women's correctional facility for conspiracy, extortion, and perjury. The Oak Ridge Country Club formally revoked her membership the very next morning, scrubbing her name from their charity boards as if she had never existed. They were both bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and entirely erased from the high society they had worshipped above their own flesh and blood. With the criminal elements surgically removed from the equation, the probate court moved swiftly. I officially and legally inherited my father's massive commercial real estate empire, executing the true original will, exactly as Thomas had intended, before his mind began to fade. The $4 million trust fund was safely released from the federal sting account and injected right back into the company's operating budget, stabilizing the entire enterprise overnight. The cowardly board members who had supported Jason's extortion attempt were immediately terminated and replaced. But I was a dedicated federal investigator, not a commercial real estate broker. I knew exactly who deserved to sit at the head of that boardroom table. I drove to the upscale downtown district and walked through the heavy glass doors of Vanguard Luxury Real Estate. The office was buzzing with electric energy. Keisha sat behind her massive mahogany desk, reviewing a thick stack of commercial property appraisals. She looked up, offering a genuine, brilliant smile. Her divorce from Jason had been finalized with brutal surgical efficiency. She had kept her luxury penthouse, her thriving brokerage, and her flawless professional reputation. I did not bring her a manila folder filled with redacted federal evidence this time. I brought a pristine gold-embossed leather portfolio. I walked across the plush carpet and placed it directly on her desk. Inside was a fully executed executive contract officially promoting Keisha to the position of Chief Executive Officer over the entire commercial real estate division of my father's company. She opened the portfolio, her eyes scanning the generous terms that gave her absolute operational control and a massive equity stake in the empire. She looked up at me, the unspoken understanding passing heavily between us. We did not need to exchange a long emotional speech. We had survived the exact same war. We had forged an unbreakable bond in the fires of their profound betrayal. The toxic bloodline had been completely severed, and in its place we had built a chosen family rooted entirely in mutual respect, competence, and fierce loyalty. I left Keisha to conquer her new corporate empire and took the private elevator down to the subterranean parking garage. My unremarkable agency-issued gray sedan was gone, permanently retired from active duty. In its place sat a sleek midnight black Porsche Carrera. I unlocked the heavy doors, slid into the luxurious red leather driver's seat, and pressed the ignition button. The high-performance engine roared to life, filling the concrete garage with a deep, resonant sound of absolute freedom. I pulled out of the parking space and merged seamlessly onto the bustling city highway, the late afternoon sun reflecting brightly off the polished hood. I gripped the leather steering wheel, looking directly into the rearview mirror, watching the towering glass buildings of my past shrink in the distance. I had dismantled my own family to protect my father's legacy, and I felt absolutely no guilt. Family is not blood, it is loyalty. Have you ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more.